But then when we're in protection mode, there's other hormones that are then going to be the primary hormones. And again, all of this is happening for our survival. All of this is happening so that our body can establish something called homeostasis. And our body is a master adapter. And so it learns how to chronically keep ourselves stuck in a certain place or a certain pattern when we repeat it over and over and over again. It just becomes a learned behavior. Are you ready to bring your dream body and health into life, but just can't seem to keep the motivation going? And is it finally time to address the self-sabotage and the unwanted eating behaviors such as binge eating, emotional eating, and nighttime eating that you know are getting in the way of your goals? Do you ever wonder what it would take for you to feel in control of your rituals so that you can stay consistent and see results? Welcome to this week's special Make Peace with Food Minisode on the Fall in Love with Fitness podcast, where you'll learn how to overcome unwanted eating behavior and other self-sabotaging habits by shifting your nervous system so that your body works with you instead of against you. I'm your host, Shaban, and with each episode, I am honored to be your coach and guide in the journey to make peace with food and find food and body freedom so that struggle with weight is a thing of the past. When you tune in every Thursday on the Fall in Love with Fitness podcast, you'll catch the latest conversation on unwanted eating behaviors and learn how to shift the nervous system, rewire the brain to new patterns, and end the food and body obsession so you finally feel relaxed and no longer confused around food. Now, before we begin, I want to quickly invite you to grab a free copy of my Food Freedom ebook that I have for you at makepeacewithfood.com. And if you find that this conversation resonates with you today, then I also want to invite you to join our free Make Peace with Food Facebook community at myfoodfreedomlifestyle.com, where you can connect with me and my team directly. The links are in the show notes. And of course, if you know somebody who you feel could benefit from these conversations and discussions, make sure to share this podcast with them too. All right, athletes, now let's get into it. Today, we're going to really be focusing on two main hormones. And the reason why we're focusing on these two main hormones, because once you address these two, everything else balances itself out. We're going to talk a little bit about estrogen today. I also want to just quickly drop in here that there are the hunger and satiety hormones, ghrelin and leptin, which we talk a lot about in our program. And so all of these hormones are influenced through these two hormones. And there's still, obviously, there's hundreds of hormones that we can be addressing today. We could be here until next week talking about them. But through all of my study and through all my research, really by learning how to control and manage these two, all the other ones correct themselves. And so it's actually hormones that dictate what our body does with food and not actually the calories that we ingest or the macros that we balance. Not actually that. It's actually hormones that decide what gets to happen. And our body releases certain hormones depending on what's going on in our environment. So depending on if we are in safety mode, there's going to be a whole bunch of hormones that will be circulating and dominating and really actually taking charge. One of those hormones, for example, is growth hormone. When we are in safety mode, there's a lot of recovery. There's a lot of repair that happens when we are in safety mode. But then when we're in protection mode, there's other hormones that are then going to be the primary hormones. And again, all of this is happening for our survival. All of this is happening so that our body can establish something called homeostasis. And our body is a master adapter. And so it learns how to chronically keep ourselves stuck in a certain place or a certain pattern when we repeat it over and over and over again. It just becomes a learned behavior. It's like learning how to drive your car. You first start to like, okay, adjust the mirror and 10 and 2, and then, okay, check the blind spots and right. But then now you can be on the phone, you can put your eyeliner on and your mascara on and drive and talk to your kids and do all these things at the same time because it becomes habituated. And so the same thing happens here. The body likes to conserve energy. It loves to conserve energy. So the moment it's like, okay, this is our loop, which we're going to be reviewing a little bit later today. Now let's just memorize that and let's keep that going on repeat. So if I snack at nighttime, that's just my routine. Every night I'm in front of the TV snacking. Well, my body learns that, right? If I teach my body to want something sweet to eat at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, I've trained my body to do that. If I believe I'm addicted to sugar, I've actually trained my body to do that. And it takes 72 hours to overcome that addiction, if you will, which again, we'll talk about today and we'll explain why. So everything is trained. And if you know about the Pavlov experiments, so maybe you've heard about this Russian dude, Pavlov, he had this experiment with his dog where he trained essentially his dog to salivate every time it heard a bell ring. At first, he would ring the bell and he would put some food for the dog. And after a while, the dog started to associate that ringing of the bell with mealtime, essentially. And then at one point, he decided, okay, well, what would happen if I took away the food and I rang the bell? So he'd take away the food, he rang the bell, and then he noticed that his dog would start salivating in preparation to the meal coming. And we actually, so think about salivating, that's pre-digestion, right? That is actually us associating an outside object or something in our environment with a bodily function. And so the same thing happens. So the couch and the TV maybe is something that I associate with snacking at night, right? So everything is learned. And again, just think of hormones as those messenger chemicals that help us adapt because the body loves to adapt. So the first thing we're going to talk about is insulin is known as the storage hormone. And this is one of the most important ones. And you may have heard about insulin when, we're talking about diabetes, but insulin is that hormone that's released from the pancreas anytime there is either sugar or protein that's sensed in the blood. Okay, so I'm going to say that again. Anytime there is sugar or glucose in the bloodstream or protein, not just sugar, then all of a sudden the pancreas releases insulin. That's that little molecule over here that you see over here. And insulin's job is to transport that energy from the bloodstream, so in the form of glucose or protein, to tissue where it's going to need it. Okay, it is the transporter hormone. And so anytime we stimulate that hormone, it's going to do exactly that job. Now, there's two types of diabetes. I won't get too much into them, but essentially, if we talk about type 2 diabetes, that's when the pancreas has been exhausted of releasing insulin because it's been overproducing it due to a lot of sugar, due to a very, very, very large amount of sugar that it has a hard time handling. And so these cells become exhausted. Another way that we also see type 2 diabetes happen is when the receptor sites on cells don't actually see the insulin. So again, both of them due to overproduction, overstimulation of the pancreas as a result of very, very, very high levels of sugar in the blood. And sugar in the blood is very, very damaging. It's actually abrasive. It can create a lot of neuropathies. So things like loss of sensation in the digits and actually tissue death, necrosis at the end of any of our fingers or our toes. And it could also lead to blindness. And so it's very dangerous to have these high levels of sugar in the blood. And so the pancreas is there to help us to release insulin and to help actually bring all of this energy to the right places where we can use them. But of course, our modern diets right now, and it's not our fault. I'm just going to say it's not our fault. We purchase foods that are marketed to us as being healthy or that they serve us. But the thing is, most of these foods, the amount of sugars or energy that is available at one time is way, way, way above what the body could naturally actually withstand. If we were to eat off the land, let's say, and we weren't eating these man-made foods, we wouldn't have such a high level of sugar circulating in the blood. And I'm also going to say protein, because especially with this whole hype, this came up yesterday. Eat protein, eat protein, eat protein, eat protein. Oh my God, if you don't eat protein after 3 hours, you're gonna lose all your muscles. What, right? Like, when have you ever heard of somebody in North America have a protein deficiency, right? If you know what marasmus looks like and you've seen what starvation actually looks like, because protein deficiency comes from starvation, like real starvation, right? And there are unfortunately 2/3 of the planet living this as a day-to-day reality, right? So that's what the pancreas does. The pancreas releases insulin, and insulin is the storage hormone. Now, it takes all of the sugar from the blood and it brings it first to the liver where it's stored, it's compacted. So what the insulin, the messenger hormone, sees is glucose, but by the time it brings it to the liver, then the liver condenses it through a process and makes something called glycogen. That's a stored hard pack form of glucose, many, many, many glucose molecules to create glycogen. And the greatest place for the body to store glycogen is going to be the liver, but it also has a limit. And once it surpasses that limit, then sugar goes to the muscle tissue next. And that's where then that's stored. So it's stored in the muscle tissue, which is really great because this is going to help us do things like go up the stairs and run if we have to, or really have energy available for us when we need it. And then anything excess after the liver has completely maxed out on its storage reserves, and same thing with the muscle tissue, anything excess now is going to go to the adipose tissue, which is your fat cells, and it's going to be converted into fat and stored there. Okay. So that's what happens. Anytime that we're going to have sugar in the bloodstream, just know that this is happening. So as soon as you have any form of sugar, whether that is a simple sugar or a complex sugar, this is going to happen. Now, the more simple your sugar, you might have heard about a high glycemic index, which really means that in a very short amount of time, you're going to have a high level of glucose in the bloodstream. So that's a high glycemic index. If you eat something that has a high glycemic index, and that's more of a simple carbohydrate, that is a refined carbohydrate, you have higher levels of insulin in the bloodstream. And if you eat something that has a lower glycemic index, that's more of a complex carb, that's more of a starch, takes more to digest, it's a slow release, then you have lower levels of insulin and it's spread out over time. So you don't have these peaks and then it's actually gradually released over time. When I was hungry, you could not talk to me. Like I wasn't hungry, I was hangry. Like I would get these insane crashes and I get headaches and I get foggy brain. I get so irritated. Like I could punch anybody in front of me. Like I needed to eat. And the reason for that is because I was constantly feeding myself regularly. So I was eating every few hours. And most of the time what I did eat was very, very simple and very, very simple carbohydrates. So I would get these insane peaks of glucose and insulin. And then all of a sudden, once it was clear from my bloodstream, boom, I'm hypoglycemic. That is that hangry feeling. And then I'd have to eat something to bring my blood sugar back up. And then boom, I'd crash again. And that was my day. That was my day. And I always had to have food with me on all times, like every 3 hours, I got to eat, right? And this was going on when I first started training, when I first got into the fitness space, because that's what they say. You got to eat every 3 hours. You got to make sure you never lose that muscle mass. And so I was eating every 3 hours and I was eating these tiny meals as recommended, right, by the bodybuilding world. And that's all I felt. I was hypoglycemic and I was constantly hangry. Okay. So I know this is a little bit heavy if you're looking at this for the first time, but all I really want you to take away from this is that insulin is the storage hormone. And anytime that the pancreas senses that there is sugar or protein in the blood, depending on how much sugar or protein there is, it's going to release insulin. Insulin's job is to transport that sugar first to the liver, stored as glycogen, then to the muscle tissue, stored as glycogen, and then anything excess is going to go to fat stores. Okay, so that it can be pulled up later and it could actually be converted back to glucose if needed, or used as fat and then helping you with hormones and all these other things, okay, which we'll leave for another day. Now, there's a second role that insulin has. So we just talked about how insulin is a storage hormone. But here's the thing. Insulin is also a fat suppressor. Okay? So if this is a transporter hormone and its job is to collect glucose and protein from the bloodstream and bring it to the right tissue, then would it make sense that it also lets things out, right? It's like, it's either you're going in storage or you're bringing things out, right? When we put our stuff in storage, that's it. We put it in storage. We don't then pull it out, right? We're not using it. Everything's going into storage. And so the more we have insulin circulating in the blood, we're always putting our body into fat storage mode. So the more we release insulin, fat storage mode. Continue to trigger insulin release, fat storage mode. So even if we have excess fat tissue, okay, our body doesn't know it's there. Our body doesn't actually see it. The more we continue to have these refined carbohydrates, the more that we continue to stimulate insulin release frequently, it's like our body is blind to the fact that we have fat stores, right? And then that gets so irritating and frustrating because I'm trying to release weight and I'm following my points and I'm following my calories and I ate exactly however many calories I need today and nothing is happening, right? But it depends on whether or not you're triggering insulin release or not, and how much of it you're doing and how frequently you're doing it. So it's not about the calories. Again, the body's not like, okay, how many calories was that? All right, let's put that in storage, put this in muscle, put this in liver. It doesn't do that. It just knows that, okay, insulin has been triggered and now we're going to go to storage and now we're going to suppress any anything else from coming out of that storage, which is generally, we're talking about fat, right? So I hope this is starting to make sense. And I hope it's also starting to make sense that the body doesn't count calories, it actually counts nutrients. And it's actually triggered very much through the hormones that are being released the most, okay? So it's, again, not about what we're eating, it's really about how the body is reacting to it. And so let's talk a little bit about how to manage insulin release. Okay. And as we talk about this, I want us to step away again from looking at diet, but actually looking at insulin. So this becomes a very interesting shift. Instead of now starting to look at my food in terms of how much is on my plate or how many grams of macros this has and how much did it weigh on my scale, what if I actually started looking at my food in terms of, okay, I'm actually going to just look at insulin. Are any of these things, that the things I'm about to put in my body, the things that I'm about to do, is that going to manage my insulin or not? And so one of the things that we could do to manage our insulin, and this is what I spoke about just a moment ago, is that we can choose more complex carbs and less refined carbohydrates. Complex carbs are the ones that are more whole food. And a whole food is a food that is in its most complete form when we consume it. So for example, having a food that did not go through many, many steps for it to arrive at my plate. So a potato is a whole food, even though many of us may be listening today really afraid to eat potatoes or haven't been able to eat potatoes without feeling guilty for years. But that's actually a whole food. And that is more superior to the body in terms of managing insulin than having bread, for example, because bread is a man-made food, right? So the more complex my carbohydrates are, and you know you're having more complex carbohydrates when, first of all, it's not as sweet. And second of all, it's a whole food. So anything that's more sweet would be a little bit more simple. And this is a very general rule, but if you just want a quick kind of hack to figure out if it's complex or not, what I would say is first and foremost, try as much as you possibly can. And this is not absolute, but try as much as you possibly can to choose more whole foods and less refined foods, okay? And to really go for foods that are going to sustain you. So things like sweet potatoes, things like, let's say, regular potatoes, yellow potatoes, squash, peas, corn, even carrots, okay? And of course, all of your vegetables and all of your fruit, all of those are complex carbs. And those are all also foods that, as you can see, are called whole foods, okay? Then the second thing is to eat less frequently. Really? Are you sure? Are you sure I should eat less frequently? I thought I should never go hungry. I thought I should be eating every 3 hours. I think someone said that yesterday. I think that was Wendy yesterday. I thought we were supposed to eat 6 times a day every 3 hours. Okay, sure, but who said that? Like, who said that? Where did that come from? Because that most likely came from the bodybuilding world. And a lot of the training and fitness information that we get is from the bodybuilding world. But have you seen Arnold? Like, do you know how many hours this man trains? And have you seen what bodybuilders do? Like they're going for gains. And especially when they're trying to put on mass and trying to put on muscle, they're eating like crazy. Of course, if I want to get bigger, I need to ingest more and I need to train more. So then I also need to eat more frequently, right? But then after that, what do? They do a serious cut before their competition. Okay, so I'm not a bodybuilder. Personally, I'm a mom and I'm a health coach and I spend a lot of time on the screen and I've got 20 minutes a day to move my body most days. And I do walk and I do these other things. So that's not really realistic for me. Do I need to eat every few hours, right? But then the other thing too, I notice is that when I eat frequently, which are probably small meals frequently, I'm hungry all the time. I don't actually feel satisfied. And so what would happen if I ate a substantial amount that actually made me feel full and satisfied and then was able to actually carry me on for several hours before I felt the need to eat again? And so this idea of frequent snacking, if we move away from that and move towards having meals that are balanced, that are really creating a lot of satiety, then you're going to notice that you don't need to eat so frequently. And the way that we create satiety in our meal is to make sure that we've got proteins in there, we've got fats in there, we've got complex carbs in there, we've got a nice mixture and melange of all of them, right? I don't personally feel very satisfied when I have just protein. I'm still jonesing for something. Notice that? Do you feel satisfied also when it's just a big plate of carbs? Just a big plate of pasta? I remember at my mother-in-law's years and years and years ago, when I used to go for Sunday lunch, oh my gosh, it was a lot of food at one time. But an hour later, I was starving. I was like, what's going on? I just ate a mountain of pasta and how am I hungry now? Right? Because I was doing this, right? And so it took a while and I had to summon the courage to start to make changes because it wasn't making me feel well on Sundays. And so that's why it's so important to, again, notice how your body's reacting to things versus you just following a particular plan or just what other people are saying. And then I just shared that earlier, eat more real foods and less fake foods. I always ask myself, is this man-made or is this God or nature or universe made, right? You plug in the word that resonates with you. But if it came from a tree, if it walked the land, if it feels like it's more natural in its original form, then those are the foods that I'm going to choose to consume. And by the way, along those lines, just notice that genetically modified food isn't a real food. It's not, there's been modifications that have happened to it. Animals, for example, that are raised in environments where they're given a lot of antibiotics and hormones, that's not very natural, right? So all of these things we have to also take into consideration. And I know this is going to sound like a lot, okay? And as we get into this place, okay, again, I have to say this, as we get into this place, I want to remind you that your progress looks like this over time. It's not like, boom, overnight, I'm gonna suddenly eat complex carbs and I'm gonna go to a farm and get grass-fed beef and all these things. No, I actually want you to choose one thing and then work on that one thing. And then once you've mastered that and it feels like, okay, I'm ready for the next one, then work on the next thing. Because that's how you create transformation. And we're not dieting here. I want you also to try this out like it's an experiment. What would happen if for 28 days, I started buying free range eggs? Let me see how I feel. What would happen if for 28 days, I started to have more complex carbs for breakfast instead of maybe my sugary cereals or maybe my white bread? What would happen? I'm not going to say I'm going to do it or not going to do it. I'm not going to commit to it from the get-go. I'm just going to try it. What would happen, right? And so we've stopped being curious. And that's the thing with diet culture is we're told, hey, if you do this after 28 days or after 6 weeks, there's a promise and you're going to release X number of pounds. And so we feel like we have to, first of all, do it to the T. It's got to be all or none. And if we miss a day or two, then, well, now it's not going to happen for us. And we're designed to be curious. We're designed to want to understand what could happen if we tried something. And this will also give you space to decide if something fits or not. You may try something and it may not be for you, and that's totally fine, right? I think I shared with you in my emails every Friday night, and I shared this also yesterday. Friday night is a tradition in my home, and I do this with my girls. I make pizza every Friday night. Yeah, it's, I've got gluten-free flour. That's not a whole food, right? And I put cheese and, I put all these other things on my pizza. And so you have to also leave that space. And here's the thing, we're moving towards more of this and less of that. It's not all or none, right? And you have to know where that line is for you, okay? So don't look at things and be like, oh my God, there's like so much to do. Let's start with number one, complex carbs. Where can I start to slowly add more of that in my day? Let me take a month to do that. And then after that, okay, eat less frequently. Okay, let's see, well, what can I do to create more satiety in my meals? And also make sure it's delicious so that I want to eat this way, right? And again, as you get into the next one, before you start buying organic and you do all that stuff, I'm just going to focus on eating more real food. I'm going to start baking. And we bake a lot in my household. I buy all kinds of ingredients. My daughters bake too. We love desserts, but we bake them because we know what the ingredients are. We get to choose the ingredients that go in there, and there's way less chemicals. In fact, there's 0 chemicals in what we're making. We make 3 or 4 ingredient type desserts. And I've got so many recipes on my website, sherryshaban.com, if you want to go check them out. And that's the idea. Few ingredients and make something delicious that is nutritious as well. And then here's another one. Avoid artificial sweeteners. And we don't oftentimes think of that because, again, we're marking calories, like 0 calories, like sugar-free there. It's a 0 calorie Coke, right? Or pop, let's say. Let's not use any of those words, right? But again, the body responds, like I was sharing earlier, that Pavlov experiment, the body responds to what it's actually anticipating. And so if I put something sweet in my mouth, even though there is no sugar, insulin will be released because my body's anticipating that there's going to be glucose. There's going to be something sweet. There's going to be sugar. And so when we're buying all that zero sugar stuff and all that artificial sweetener stuff, just know that you're still stimulating insulin release. And while sure, maybe there's no sugar in the bloodstream to be stored in fat tissue, to be stored in the liver and in the muscle tissue, remember that second role of insulin. It's still suppressing fat release. So the more I do this, drinking diet pop all day, I'm just telling my body, hey, I'm still producing insulin. I'm telling my body, nope, keep that where it's at. Keep the reserves exactly where it's at. Okay. So try to move away from that. And then the other thing too, just on a side note, we don't know the long-term effects of a lot of these artificial sweeteners. We don't know the long-term effects, but we are seeing an interesting trend in our society, aren't we? There are certain diseases that all of a sudden are skyrocketing in our society, right? Where's that coming from, right? And what's interesting, in the last 20, 30, 40 years, we've introduced a lot of man-made food into our diet, right? And then finally, circadian rhythm. Okay, circadian rhythm is really important. Circadian rhythm, that is your internal clock. And your internal clock is basically aligned with the sun. So the moment you wake up, your body, and more specifically your hormones, are aligning with the sun, especially if you actually expose your eyes to sunlight. There's certain cells, cone cells on the eye that pick up certain waves, and then they start to actually react in a certain way by producing certain enzymes and certain hormones at different times of the day and peak at different times of the day. So when you wake up in the morning, usually cortisol is kind of high compared to the rest of the day. Naturally, cortisol is high. Why? Because you wake up and you're ready to go. But in the evening, insulin is actually low. So at 7 p.m., you become insulin resistant. At 7 p.m., you start to become insulin resistant, which means at 7 p.m., what's going to end up happening to whatever you're eating after 7 or let's say 8 p.m., most of it's going to go into storage. It's actually not going to be used in that same way. And it makes sense, right? Because your body's winding down for bed. It actually wants to stimulate growth hormone. It wants recovery, right? While you're sleeping, you're resting. It wants to rejuvenate certain things. It wants to restore certain functions. So it's actually getting you to stop eating and prepare for bed. But that's not what we always do, right? In our society, right? That evening time is reserved for snacking in front of the TV. So whatever you're consuming after 7 p.m., you have a higher chance of putting that in storage than you do anytime earlier in the day. Okay. So you'll also notice that when you eat later at night, you wake up not feeling super hungry in the morning. So then it just becomes this vicious cycle where you push that first meal a little bit later, you eat later in the day, and then you eat your last meal later in the day, right? So if you feel like you're stuck in that pattern, you can get out of it by just readjusting your meal times, okay? And try to keep that 7 p.m. cutoff. Again, I'm going to think about this differently. I'm not thinking about 7 p.m. cutoff in terms of, okay, I plan to lose 10 pounds in 2.5 hours. I got to do my cutoff. I'm actually thinking about, well, how can I manage insulin? All right, after 7 p.m., insulin reacts a little bit different. My body doesn't favor insulin release at night. So, all right, well, what can I do to maybe rearrange my schedule so that it actually starts to match a little bit? And then the last thing I put here is non-purposeful exercise. And purposeful and non-purposeful exercise, you're going to learn all about this in the program, but essentially we categorize two different types of exercise. A non-purposeful exercise is the movement that was not planned throughout the day. That's walking. That's really things that are executed at a low heart rate. It could be gardening. It could be cleaning your house. And that's actually the time where you can manage insulin the most, because when you do high cardio, so if you are a cardio bunny and you're listening in here and all you do is run and notice that over time you've just been putting on weight, first of all, that type of cardio is catabolic. It breaks down muscle tissue, which we'll talk a little bit about tomorrow. But then the other thing too is that it stimulates hunger, right? So you'll notice when you do high intensity, a lot of cardio, you're hungry, right? Because you drop that blood sugar so quickly. And now to make up for it, your body's going to release ghrelin and you're going to feel hungry. And again, another conversation, but if you want to manage insulin, then think more about how you can move throughout your day without it being at such a high heart rate. So where you can have, let's say, a nice conversation and move your body without it being so heavy. Okay. So I know that was heavy, but here's the good news. Insulin is the easiest hormone to reset, and it takes less than 3 days. Okay. And this is scientifically proven. So if you're hearing this and you want to start to make changes, like I said, choose one at a time. and you're going to be able to adjust that. All right, so now many of us who are in perimenopause or menopause, and we're always told, oh, once you go to menopause, you're going to put on weight, right? But it's not actually the fact that you're decreasing estrogen and progesterone, because that's what happens when you're in perimenopause and menopause. Your body stops producing as much estrogen and progesterone, so you actually lower that production. But it's actually due to estrogen dominance. And estrogen dominance means, well, there's this balance between estrogen and progesterone. And once the estrogen is higher than the progesterone, even if these two are actually still produced at a lower level, that's still called estrogen dominance. It's just about the balance and not about the quantity, right? So anytime you are in an estrogen dominant situation, so that could still be menopause, that could still be perimenopause, and that could be PCOS, because in PCOS, you're actually producing excess estrogen. But anytime that's happening, it could promote weight gain. But here's the thing. Estrogen and insulin work hand in hand in that situation. So you'll notice that if you do have PCOS, or if you are maybe experiencing estrogen dominance, one of the things that you're told is eat less sugar, right? Walk, do some of that stuff, eat more complex carbohydrates, right? Because they're actually still getting you to manage insulin, right? So it just favors it, but still the mechanism is through insulin. And so it's all going to depend on the blood sugar level and insulin levels at the end of the day, and not just that one standalone hormone. Okay. So again, if you manage insulin and you are in perimenopause or menopause, everything will correct itself. Okay. Now, the other hormone we're going to talk about is cortisol. Cortisol is the primary hormone, along with adrenaline, that's produced when we are in fight or flight or protection mode. And of course, if we are in this chronic state of constant stress, we're in a crazy project, there's a lot of major life events happening. We feel like we need help. We feel overwhelmed. We're worried about things happening. We feel like we're ready to push that panic button. Anytime that's really the baseline thoughts of our lives, like that's what's on repeat all the time, we're going to lock ourselves into protection mode. And therefore, like I was saying earlier, because the body's a master adapter, well, we're going to just get used to those high levels of cortisol. And so we stay in that loop. And so remember, we trigger our nervous system through our thoughts. So if I am focusing on thoughts that worry me, oh my God, what happens if I run out of money? Oh my God, how am I going to pay my bills next month? Oh my God, what if he leaves me? Oh my goodness, my weight. Oh my God, what am I going to do? How am I going to lose this weight? Oh my God, my class reunion's coming up and I'm right. Any thoughts that are creating stress for me, no matter which area of your life you're talking about, you are going to trigger protection mode. And cortisol also has several roles. Okay, so I shared with you yesterday, anytime that you are in protection mode, your metabolism is going to slow down. That is a natural function. This is because of survival. Your body wants to ensure your survival. And so it's going to try to conserve energy as much as possible by making you feel heavy to do things. Things feel like they require a lot of effort. You're not going to feel like getting up and going for a walk. And even while you're training, it's going to feel like, oh my God, I'm lugging a dead body along here with me, right? And it's also going to promote fat storage, especially around the midsection. So anytime we have that belly and somewhere around the belly button, that's oftentimes due to cortisol. Why? Because the body wants fat storage available for it right at the organs where it's going to be able to use it quickly, right? If it's in the extremities, if it's in the legs, it's going to take a long time by the time it gets to the digestive system and where things can start to happen, and get to the liver where things can start to happen. And so it tends to store fat in the midsection. And you'll notice once you're in a lot of stress, when it's been many weeks of maybe a major life event, or it's been years of that, and you tend to notice like, oh my God, I never used to store around my midsection and now I do. It's because you've been in a prolonged state of protection mode, and therefore cortisol has been swimming in your bloodstream for a very long time. Okay. And as I shared yesterday, cortisol's role is also to increase your appetite, like insane cravings. And so it turns on that binge response. Again, this is part of the reptilian brain. So you have more desire to eat, and not just eat anything. Again, it's very specific because it controls circulating glucose, which is another role of cortisol. It's going to actually get you to crave the foods that's going to give it the most amount of sugar instantly. And again, that's the processed foods, that's the refined foods, that's the foods that are high in energy that don't require a great portion. So that's why you'll be driven and attracted to sweets and chips and things that really are very easy to offer you that available energy. And so if you learn how to control cortisol, if you learn how to shift your body from protection mode to safety mode, most importantly, then that's when you see an increase in metabolism. That's when you see that your body starts to release its fat storage. It doesn't need to do that anymore. You'll notice the cravings magically go away. Like it's weird. I don't crave sugars anymore. I don't crave that evening binge that I used to do in front of the TV every night. And I don't have those same circulating levels of glucose. So again, the glucose, and here's why cortisol does this. The glucose levels in the blood is very, very important, because this is the fight, flight, or freeze response, right? This is that mode that your body has to take on when it's feeling unsafe in its environment, and it needs instant energy to be able to react. If I suddenly have to run, if I suddenly have to push something, if I suddenly have to hit somebody, I need instant energy. And so because at the same time my body is storing fat and doesn't want to release that fat, it wants to reserve it for later, it turns on that binge response so that I get all that glucose instantly from what I'm eating versus what's available in my storage. So I hope that resonates with you. I hope, again, you start to see why, if you're just managing your calories and your macros and not really controlling these two hormones, that you actually start to see that your body's going to favor that storage. And remember that every single thought creates chemistry in the body, right? So like I was sharing earlier, that as soon as you have a thought that worries you, as soon as you have a self-deprecating thought, like you're really say something really mean to yourself, as soon as you start to blame, you start to criticize, you start to shame, you start to complain about stuff, as soon as you're in that space and you have these thoughts, then right away, it's going to produce a neurotransmitter that's going to be very, very specific for a particular neuropeptide. If you thought something that made you angry, you're going to start to feel it in your skin. You're going to be like, right? If you start to feel something that made you worry, you're going to start to sweat maybe. If you started to be fearful, right? Your body reacts to every single thought in a different way. And then that neuropeptide travels to the gland. And in this case, we're talking about cortisol. So it goes to the adrenal gland and it releases cortisol. What does cortisol do? Cortisol goes back to the brain and says, hey, produce more of those thoughts. We're in the loop now. And then again, you have that feeling coming from the neuropeptide. And again, you're triggering and releasing more of that hormone, cortisol, from the adrenal gland. And again, you're stuck in this loop, right? So it could constantly be end of month, I always worry about this thing. Or every time my kid goes out, I'm always worried about this thing. Or every time I think about weight, I'm always worried about this thing. That is the loop that I'm trapped in. My body has put that together in a nice package and made it a program. This is the program that it's running on repeat. So every time that same prompting event triggers that feeling that I don't want to sit in, that familiar feeling, if it's anxiety, if it is worry, if it's stress, if it's doubt, if it's fear, I'm going to try to avoid it. And generally, I'm going to try to choose something that's going to pull me away from that feeling of discomfort and move me towards that temporary relief, that pleasure. And I could do that in the form of a drink. I could do that in the form of smoking a joint. I could do that through food. I could do that through shopping. Doesn't it feel so good? You're like, oh, I just bought this on Amazon. Then you're like, oh, what have I done? Oh my God, I haven't even paid my credit card bill this month. Well, you only think about that later. Kind of like sitting down with the whole row of Oreos. You only think about the consequence later. But the moment that suddenly there's awareness of that consequence, you get that secondary emotion, another dysregulated emotion. Now it's guilt. Now it's shame. Now it's frustration. Now it's disappointment. Now it's regret. And then boom, you're stuck in this cycle. Again, this is just learned. Just like Pavlov's dog, this is learned. And we can unlearn this if we know how to interrupt the pattern. And we do this through the program. We break this up even more in the program because there's actually more links that happen than what I'm just sharing with you here. There's thoughts, emotions, feelings, body sensations, thoughts, emotions, feeling, body sensations. There's another 20 body sensations that happen here while you're in this loop. But if you know what they are and you know how to interrupt it, then all of a sudden now you have that advantage of overcoming that pattern.
Questions.
All right. Questions.
There are a few questions. There's a few about cortisol.
Okay.
Wendy had asked, how do we turn off that loop when we were talking about cortisol and that loop that we get in? We may have already answered that with the pattern interrupt. Wendy, let us know if that was or not. But I also want to say, Terry asked a similar question regarding help with cortisol. Moved 10 times in the past 12 months. What do I do about constant stressing and raised cortisol? Female, age 59.
So good. I'm so happy that you bring up this question, because we know what we're supposed to do, but oftentimes we get stuck in the how we're supposed to do that. And so what I was saying earlier is, when we're monitoring behavior, or more importantly, monitoring mindset, the way that our progress looks like over time is, maybe 5 days a week I feel stressed, or I'm binge eating or emotional eating or eating sugar, and then now it's 4 days a week, and then now it's 3 days a week, and now it's twice a week, and so on and so forth, until it becomes less and less and less frequent. And so that's how we monitor the progress. But there are tools that you have to try to see if really you can start to shift that. And like I was sharing earlier, it all starts with a trigger. It starts with a trigger, and the trigger is something that we pick up from our environment, and it is picked up through the five senses. So it's something we see, it's something we smell, hear, taste, and so on, or even touch. And that's what brings up the thought. And as soon as we have that thought, and it's evaluating that thought, that we will trigger the emotion. And so the emotions that are normally related with protection mode, and you'll notice that you're in protection mode often if you're sitting in most of these emotions most of the time: anxiety, stress, overwhelm, worry, doubt, uncertainty, fear, remorse, regret, depression, right? All of that is protection mode. And you know that you are in safety mode when you feel relaxed and grateful and abundant and peaceful, and you feel safe. And that's really, really the most important thing. And I'll kind of just bring it all down to that word of safety. The more you feel unsafe through what you're thinking, through what you're saying, through how you're behaving, the more you're going to be in protection mode. And so the tools that we use, they're dialectical thinking tools. So we use DBT, we use forms of psychology, we use hypnotherapy, we use breathing techniques, we use breath work, we use meditation, we use a lot of different techniques. So it'd be hard to explain them all here. But again, that's what you get to learn and practice and master, more importantly, in the program. And the other thing too is that there's hundreds of tools. And so it's important to try them all and see which one resonates with you. For some people, breath work is very powerful. For other people, and myself included, it took me a while to get into the breath work thing. It's like, what am I just gonna sit here and breathe? Like, what's that supposed to change? But your breath changes when you're in protection mode or safety mode, which is why we use certain exercises to change the breath. The moment you change the breath, then all of a sudden change physiology, and then all of a sudden you'd also change the nervous system. And so a lot of things have to be adjusted for this to happen. And the things that have to be adjusted are the things in your environment that make you feel unsafe.
Beautifully said. I see Wendy said yes, thank you. So that did answer her question as well. And then earlier, Wendy also asked, when we were talking about frequency of eating, she said, so it's not good to eat every 2 to 3 hours? I thought it stimulates metabolism to eat within the first hour of waking and then keep it going every 3 hours.
Great. So good. So first of all, just to unpack that a little bit, we want to move away from good and bad. Okay. When we talk about food, when we talk about things, it's not good, it's not bad. Okay. And the second thing I'll say is, when it comes to information that we ever hear, we have to ask ourselves, well, where did we hear that? And who said it? And why did they say that? Right? So if I'm sitting down with a bodybuilder who's super jacked and maybe 50 pounds heavier in muscle, and they're competing and they've got a competition coming up and they train 6 hours a day, and like who's saying this to me, right? So for me to really get the right information that's appropriate to me, I need to maybe sit down with somebody, like I was sharing earlier on Instagram, somebody where they're doing the things that I want to do, or they've done the things that I'm already trying to do. So information is really, 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 really important to monitor and audit, right? That's like the first thing I'll say to you, because the information is overwhelming. You don't need me sitting here in front of you today to tell you what to eat. You don't need that. You don't need anyone really to sit and tell you how to exercise. You can go on YouTube, you can go on Google, you can find all this information, right? But I also want to remind you that anyone can post anything. Like, you can go post about, eating carrots to, become a bodybuilder and then be able to glow in the dark. Like, you can write that and you can put some scientific proof and people will believe it, right? So first question, where does it come from? Second of all, again, the body responds to what the food is doing to it through hormones. So the reaction is through hormones. And when we eat frequently, most likely that food will have carbohydrates and protein. We are releasing insulin. Insulin's job is to store energy as well as to suppress any release of it. So I hope that that answers your question. And this eating every 2 to 3 hours, again, comes from the bodybuilding world mostly. And then the last thing I'll say is like, okay, well, if I'm repeating the same thing over and over again and it's not giving me the result that I want, is it time to now question that belief? I've been eating every 2 to 3 hours for the last 10 years because it's supposed to speed up my metabolism, but it hasn't, right? I'm still struggling with it, right? So then maybe now is the opportunity or the chance to try something different. Thank you for listening to this week's Make Peace with Food Minisode on the Fall in Love with Fitness podcast. If this has resonated with you today, I want to invite you to subscribe to the show so you never miss a beat. And if you know someone who could benefit from this conversation, then please share this episode with them. Let's work together to help as many people as possible make peace with food and fall in love with fitness. And by the way, I need to mention that if you rate and review this podcast on iTunes and send over the screenshot to Sherry at sherryshaban.com, you'll receive a $500 voucher to join me at one of my upcoming retreats or to use it in our Make Peace with Food coaching program. And don't forget to visit myfoodfreedomlifestyle.com to join the free Facebook group for more resources. And remember, athlete, you are an inspiration. I cannot wait to hear your story.